All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. As you're getting signed in, I see some participants coming in right now. If you'd like, if you're familiar with Zoom, you'll see down, one of the options with your webinar software is to be able to chat. And if you just go ahead in the chat box and put in where you're calling in from, it'd be really interesting to see where folks are coming in from. And then we'll pass along to everyone. You can see the folks that we've got attending. And I'm Rob Herndon from the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. I'll be presenting with you today. And we have, let's see, Jennifer Everett calling in from Raleigh, so not too far down the road. I'm in Williamsburg, Virginia, so just a few hours north of there. And we're also joined by Nick Hoole, also from the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. He's up in the Cleveland area, in Cleveland Heights, I believe. And Nick will be on the line today to field any questions, see if he can answer them immediately. And if he can't, then he'll bring it, or if he just wants me to expand upon it, because Nick can answer virtually everything from what I've seen.
Sure.
But if he wants me to expand upon it, then he'll jump in and share that. And Nick, yeah, if you want to say hi to everybody, I see we've got some folks that have joined in now.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick, as Rob said. And as Rob said, I'll be here to try to answer your questions behind the scenes. And if I can't or want Rob to speak more on it or talk about other examples from what I talk about, then I'll be voicing those during a couple breaks we have throughout the next hour.
All right, great. Thanks, Nick, and really appreciate your help today to make this run smoothly. So welcome everyone to today's webinar, where we're going to cover Entrepreneurial Mindset 101, essentially our work here at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative, and some of the key details around our Ice House Entrepreneurship Program. So as we get rolling here, the first 20 minutes or so, I'll be talking about the philosophy behind the Ice House program, sort of the general thoughts that have come into play, both in the formation of the program and then our follow-on research over the last decade or so. And then we'll take time for some questions after that first 20 minutes. Then we'll jump into the details on the program itself, how it was designed, how it gets put forth in a classroom setting or an online setting. And then we'll take some questions after that, after about 20 minutes. And then the last portion of the program, I'll just run through what we call our use cases, sort of the case studies. Just give you a sample of some of the folks who have used the program and the types of results that they're seeing, just to give you some ideas there. So for those who are just joining in, if you didn't hear me previously, you'll have a chat bar and a Q&A bar. If you've got questions, go ahead and submit those at any time, and Nick will go ahead and get on those for you. And if you're in, have logged in, since I mentioned it in that chat box, you can go ahead and plug in where you're from and just say hi to everyone that's out on the webinar with us. All right, so with that, I will go ahead and get going and get the slides projected, and we'll go ahead into the presentation. All right, so as I mentioned, Rob Herndon, I'm the president of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative here in Williamsburg, Virginia, and happy to run through this webinar with you today to give you an idea about our work. And you can, see our work on all the social media, Twitter we've got there at Eli Mindset, but everything else we can, in the follow-up email, you'll get connection to our other social media. So the work we do at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative is centered around the entrepreneurial mindset and educating folks around the world about how entrepreneurs think. And we look at entrepreneurship through a behavioral lens. So we're not only looking at it from sort of the typical business discipline where it's usually patterned after. So I'll describe some details, some pretty good details on sort of our philosophy behind that as we get going here. The other big part of our work is professional development programs. We do a lot of teacher training, a lot of faculty training, administrator training in the educational world, but we also do it across the board in government, in libraries. We're having a lot of work now going on, really across the board, and I'll get into that towards the end. And really our goal is to help folks thrive, both as individuals within their organizations and help organizations thrive, and then ultimately to help our communities thrive and flourish through the entrepreneurial mindset. All right, so let's dig in a little bit here of how we define entrepreneurship. You know, most folks, when you bring up the word entrepreneurship, they're probably going to flash in their brain like Mark Zuckerberg, somebody they might think of, or you know, any of the other big names like Elon Musk, Richard Branson that you see in the news. And you know, it's when you look at the statistics and the reality out in the world, we have a representation versus a reality problem when we talk about entrepreneurship. And meaning that the folks that are in the press and, you know, constantly in our faces every day are not necessarily representative of entrepreneurship and what it's all about and what happens in an entrepreneurial effort on a daily basis. And that's because, you know, these VC-backed, high-growth entrepreneurs are what everyone thinks of, but they're not thinking about the folks that are right around the corner, probably their next-door neighbors or right down the street in their community, the everyday entrepreneurs who just have an idea and a vision, and they're trying to bring that out into the world. So we feel that, you know, lots of the discussion that's going on in the world around entrepreneurship right now, many times can focus on, you know, trying to emulate Silicon Valley or, you know, make our area just like this high tech, you know, let's draw everybody in for high tech, but they're not tapping into the human capital that's there in their own communities right now by thinking of everyone in their space who's an entrepreneur. And you know, it's sort of like putting lottery winners out there as exemplars when you're trying to teach financial literacy. It just doesn't make sense. You've got to go much beyond that. So we feel we've got to define the entrepreneurial mindset by getting much deeper than just, hey, how does Mark Zuckerberg think? Or what's Elon Musk, you know, what's his 5 things and the ways that he looks at the world? So how do we define entrepreneurship here at Eli? We start with the work of Howard Stevenson. We think he gets pretty close to how we like to define it, where, you know, Howard was a, you know, long-term business faculty member at the Harvard Business School. And this was his way of defining entrepreneurship, that entrepreneurship is a pursuit of opportunity beyond resources controlled. And that's, you know, good. It hits the mark, but it's a little academic, you know, I mean, it's coming from Harvard, so you understand that. So we like to describe it ultimately as an opportunity discovery process. And, you know, we back that up with the work of, if you look at complex systems and you look at how things operate in that first portion, when, you know, folks are trying to connect to the world, they're ultimately in this area of search. And that's something that we go into pretty deeply in our training that I'll talk to you a little bit about later on. I'm not going to go into the details of it today, but I think we can give you the reasoning why entrepreneurship ultimately falls in that area where it's all about opportunity discovery. So it's looking at the world around you and what opportunities are out there. And, you know, as an individual or even an organizational perspective, you know, you can look at the world as, you know, what are my personal interests? What types of abilities do I have? And then looking outwards, what are those needs of others? Because that's where the opportunity lies. If you're trying to solve problems for other people, that opportunity becomes apparent. So we like to show this Venn diagram to essentially say, hey, that sweet spot in the middle, if you can hit that, it's really going to help guide you down a path towards thinking like an entrepreneur, because you're combining those interests and abilities that you have and applying them towards the needs of others. It's sort of the first piece you've got to hit. And, you know, when you're looking for opportunity, it requires all these skills. And, you know, educators that are on the webinar with me are going to recognize these as the types of skills that they want their students to have as they, you know, exit their degree programs. And everybody else is going to recognize hey, these are the types of skills that we want folks to have if they're coming to work in my organization or to work with them and collaborate with them. And it's these types of skills, that empathy, the observation and inquiry, being great creative, critical thinkers, communication and collaboration. These are the types of skills that allow you to thrive when you're searching for opportunity, because you have to be open to what's out there. You have to have a really open mindset and looking outwards. So when we think about that in our context of our world today, it's like, why do we care? Why do we care about looking at this entrepreneurial mindset? And I imagine all of you who are, joined us on the webinar today, you have your own reasons. But we, understand that these skills that are learned through entrepreneurship education and understanding the entrepreneurial mindset are preparing people and organizations to adapt and thrive in the world as it changes and morphs, and this complex system of a world that we live in as it's constantly changing. Without those skills, you can't keep up with that change. So we make the connection to that entrepreneurial mindset is going to allow you to think like an entrepreneur and therefore be able to adapt in the world. And let me explain a little bit more what I mean about the change that's happening in our world today. We like to refer to the work of, Tom Friedman and this book, Thank You for Being Late. He has a really interesting portion of the book where he interviews Astro Teller, who is the Google X, sort of Google's R&D arm. He interviews him to discuss this idea of acceleration and what's happening in our world. And the way Teller describes it is he lays out this graph of, okay, over time, the growth of technology. So sort of seen here, in a very steep curve here. And then he talks about this concept that, if you were born around the year 1000 and, somehow went to sleep and then Rip Van Winkle woke up, 100 years later, the world probably hasn't changed a whole lot. It's probably going to look very similar. Everybody's still walking around in ox carts and dirt paths, and not much has changed. But if you go forward to, let's say, the 1900s, and if you look at the 1900s, it was lots of change going on in the world between the development of the aircraft or, gas-driven cars, any of these technological change, the radio, television. But as these technological changes were being made, people still had time to adapt. When you start getting to where we are now and, almost at 2020, a little hard to believe that we're almost at 2020, but when you start getting to the pace of change we're out here with Moore's Law and the computing power that's changed and the rise of artificial intelligence, most folks are not able to adapt to that. And there's a reason for that. As humans, our biology is such that we can only adapt to change in, over a long period of time. We can't immediately adapt our biology and our psychology to deal with these changes that are going on in the world. And granted, the reason there's a little bit of an upswing in this line on human adaptability is because, with the adaptation of, the development of the printing press and getting knowledge and obviously the internet, like getting knowledge out to the world, we've been able to learn and adapt more quickly as a species than we had previously because of that access to knowledge, but we still are not going to defeat our biology and our psychology. We're just not going to be able to keep up with that rate of change. Because ultimately, none of us has the capability to comprehend all of the changes that are happening on a daily basis. One of the things that most folks are talking about is like, hey, I just feel like I'm inundated with information constantly. I can't keep up with the changes that are going on in the world. And that's human, that's okay. But as Teller describes it, if you look back in that, the Middle Ages, okay, we were at a time of static stability. Things weren't changing very much. But as we got to the 1900s, we started seeing this occasional destabilization. Things were happening, new technologies coming on board that people had to adapt to. They couldn't use, horse and buggies on the streets anymore, at least not as much, and, had to adapt to the automobile. And also our laws and our ways of, our public policy, our systems of education, et cetera, they had time to adapt and to make changes to make sure that people could thrive appropriately in the world. But today, we live in this world of constant destabilization. So not just as individuals, how do we as organizations keep up with this rate of change? So Teller talks about this idea of dynamic stability. When things are moving at such the pace, it's like riding a bike. You have to be in motion. You can't just sit still. So this idea of constantly growing and learning is how Teller describes it. Those that are it's not the strongest or the most intelligent, but the ones that are most responsive to change, those that can adapt and grow. And as Teller describes it, he talks about this idea of learning faster and governing smarter. So as individuals, we need to adapt new information and to change more quickly, to unlearn and relearn capabilities that we thought, maybe would have lasted a little bit longer. Most of us, at least of my age, went through school with the thought that, once I got my degrees, I'd be off into the world and I probably wouldn't have to go back to the well to learn a lot more. But I think we've recognized that over time, you're constantly having to learn. So to keep up, we constantly have to develop our skills and be thinking in this way and open to new things. That sort of entrepreneurial mindset will give us. And for our institutions, we have to learn how to govern smarter, to be able to adapt and change to all these changes that we're seeing in the world. So ultimately what Teller is saying is that both individuals and organizations have to optimize for learning. And we feel at the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative that the entrepreneurial mindset is optimized for learning. And I think I'll be able to convince you of that today when we talk about the types of skills and growth that happens when someone goes through an entrepreneurial process. And that's because, when someone is being entrepreneurial, they have to be creative. To solve those problems for other people, they have to come up with new ideas and sort of the realm of possibilities. Then they have to critically think through those ideas. They can't, just sort of let them sit there. They've got to start thinking about it and like, all right, is this going to work? Or maybe I should start working down this path. Let me really think through so that they can boil down those creative ideas. They have to communicate it out into the world. Lots of people have ideas, but if you're not acting on it, then what good is it doing? And they have to collaborate. In our world today, we recognize we can't do things just on our own. We have to do it with the help of others. And ultimately, as we all know, in going through this process, you're going to have lots of failures. So you just have to learn how to be resilient. Then going through that process, you develop a more optimistic outlook. And it's one of the natural things that comes along with being entrepreneurial that I'm going to dive into a little bit more when we get into the program. And then ultimately, you have to be resourceful because as we talked about, if you're starting off on your own venture or even just, a college kid looking out into the world, like, what am I going to do with my life? You only have limited resources. You don't, not everybody has that venture capital backed, startup thing that we were talking about, right? This is the everyday person. So you have to rely on whatever resources are there, both monetarily, with your time, with what type of connections that you have, because ultimately that resourcefulness is what's going to drive you forward with your idea. So with that definition of understanding how we see entrepreneurship and why it's so important for our world and having an entrepreneurial mindset, we come to this definition of an entrepreneurial mindset. And this is how Eli defines it, that this is the core assumption that the entrepreneurial person is making, that ultimately it's their responsibility to figure out how to make themselves useful to others. That's the critical element. And by doing that, they empower themselves. So it's a combination pact here, right? You're not just altruistic. You're not just, it's not charity. You're not just giving away whatever you have to be useful to others. That's great. That's that's what the world needs, those things. But when we're talking about this entrepreneurial mindset, you're doing things useful for others so that you can also gain some benefits from that as well and empower yourself. And ultimately, the biggest thing that we're looking to do is to have you flourish and to have a set of, a understanding of mindfulness in the world, and well-being is ultimately the goal. So when we talk about how this entrepreneurial mindset is formed, this is, based on our research over the last 10 years, we've come to that usefulness of others being the center point that everyone goes back to. And there's a lot of drivers here when you look at the psychology. If you look at the work of Dr. Julian Rotter, he talks about the power of an internal locus of control, of worrying about the things that you can change and not getting so wrapped around the axle about things that you can't change. So entrepreneurs tend to have if we're looking at it on a spectrum, they tend to just focus on the things they have to worry about in that internal locus of control. There have, in the orange there, the high levels of self-efficacy. Over time, they recognize that, if I put effort into this, I can see that change happen, and I, think I have the ability to do that. They build up this self-efficacy over time, which is ultimately, one of those great skills we're trying to teach our kids to, students, et cetera, and we want our workers to have. Entrepreneurs at, at their base have a growth mindset where they recognize that they've got to learn new things. They can't feel like their knowledge is just fixed. They have to be ready to learn. So they definitely have this growth mindset. They're very resilient. I've talked about, that failure happens and, change happens. So they have to be resilient and, go through those failures with an optimistic explanatory style. They have to look at things from an optimistic perspective. And, sure, you can be a pessimist at heart, but you can change and grow your optimistic side to be more entrepreneurial. And then ultimately, the intrinsic motivation of bringing their idea out into the world is what gets them up out of bed every day. It's not to make that next $1 million. That's sort of a scorecard. It's or $5 or $10. It's the intrinsic value they see of getting their idea and helping others out into the world. Okay, so with that, that's essentially our discussion of the philosophy behind the program. So I just want to see if there's any questions or anything I can handle right now with the group. Okay, let's see.
We've got one from Patrick Snyder about asking about data on how well our program works, which I think you'll be getting into in some detail in the next few portions.
Yeah, Patrick, after I get through how the program works, then I've got our case studies. I'll dive into things like in the community college space where persistence, like students coming from first semester and then returning the second semester, like a 28% higher increase. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about the skills that kids are learning at the K through 12 environment, things that are happening in Albuquerque at their city government. So just stand by and I'll get into some of that here in a few minutes.
Ed is asking, can you provide some insight on the new online training that is being offered in 2020?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. We are excited to be offering our first online training. I wasn't going to do that till the end, but I'll at least, since you asked the question about it, when we formed our program, it was with the idea you would become a facilitator and then take it out into the world. We've historically only done our training in person, and for the first time in February, we're going to do that online. So folks aren't going to have to travel, or we aren't going to have to travel to them to do that training. And I'll talk about that a little bit more right at the end, but that is something we're pretty excited about. All right. Well, I will jump on back in, Nick, and we'll get into the program itself. So let's talk about the features of our Ice House program. I got to give you some background here so you can understand, where this all came from. So our CEO and founder of Eli now, Gary Schoniger, he was hired in around 2007 by the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute to take a look at the entrepreneurial ecosystem around the world and determine what's missing. What do we need to help drive entrepreneurship and get more people on board with starting new businesses? If you look at the historical drive behind economies, it is that entrepreneurial spirit. So That was what Gary was charged with. So he went around and he interviewed a couple hundred of these unlikely entrepreneurs who I've been, mentioning, the everyday entrepreneurs. And many times it was folks who were coming from some pretty rough circumstances in their young lives, and how they were able to overcome that by pushing their idea out into the world. And one of the folks he ran across in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is a gentleman here I just have up on the screen, is Clifton Talbert. Now, Clifton has an amazing story. And as Gary was interviewing him, he asked him, who was it that taught you to think like an entrepreneur? And when, Clifton started to answer that question, he pulled this picture out of a shoebox there in his office. And he said, you know what, Gary? It was my Uncle Cleve. And Clifton started to tell this, told Gary the story of how, as a young teenager, he was about 13 at the time, the 1950s in the Mississippi Delta, prior to integration in the South. So, for those that, coming from other places and aren't familiar with our history, where African Americans could not integrate at all with folks who were white in the South by law. This, despite this structure that was there around them, Cleve was the owner of the local Ice House. And he provided ice to everyone in the community. It didn't matter where they were coming from, race, religion, et cetera. He was providing that service to everyone in the community. And Clifton had the opportunity to work for his uncle when the rest of the folks in his community were literally still getting on field trucks to go out into the fields and pick cotton every day, just as it had been for generations prior to that. And Clifton started recognizing that, there's maybe something else for me out there. And Clifton does a great job of describing the history of that when you read the book, or if you see any of his video clips where he talks about it. But, Clifton goes on to say that everything he'd learned that made his life possible at the level of excellence that he was able to get to in his life, he learned from his Uncle Cleve working for him for just a few years in the Ice House. And Clifton, for those that don't know his story, young Clifton, as he went on in his life, he eventually became a Pulitzer Prize nominated author who's written 14 books. He had one of his books made into a major motion picture. He was the founder and involved with the initial development of the Stairmaster. So if you've been punished by that in the gym, you can thank Clifton for that. So he has this amazing entrepreneurial story. He was an Air Force veteran. He did some amazing things, with starting and being the president of a bank. And he eventually, briefed at the Library of Conference and Congress and the Supreme Court. So just has an amazing story that he all ties back to his Uncle Cleve. And, from that story, Gary saw, what, Clifton, they decided to write this book together, which is Who Owns the Ice House? 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. And in the book, if you haven't read it, Clifton tells his life story as, half of each chapter. And then Gary jumps in the second half and says, okay, there's 8 life lessons that we saw in common that were common and replicable. These are things that anyone can learn and that were common and replicable, sorry about that, from all these interviews that he had done of these unlikely entrepreneurs around the country. So that's how the book is structured, is around those 8 life lessons. And from that, we worked with, in the early 2010s, around 2011, the Ice House Entrepreneurship Programs were developed. So the book forms the baseline for the program. Then we worked with the Kauffman Foundation. They provided some initial funding where we were able to develop our original edition. And since then, 2015, we launched our student success version, which has, had great results. Our small business version was also just prior to that time, specifically for small business educators. And then just this year, we've launched our middle school version of our program, as more and more people have told us, we really need to be hitting that age youth with these types of ideas. So all of the programs have similar course objectives. They want to make entrepreneurship accessible to everyone. This is not just for kids or people who identify as entrepreneurs. We want to bring everyone into the conversation. We want to inspire folks with real world examples, and that's done through those interviews that Gary did in his tour and interviewing all those entrepreneurs. We want them engaging, so it's experiential. They go through a basic entrepreneurial process, so we have them engaging in that full process. We focus on the mindset. We're not digging into writing business plans or doing the financial and the legal aspects associated with the program. We're talking about the psychology behind the program. We're having them exercise their muscles, their entrepreneurial muscles, by doing the experiential part to grow that entrepreneurial mindset. And a big piece of the program is connecting it to the community. You know, the facilitators of the program bring in everyday entrepreneurs into the classroom to talk about their life stories. And you know, it's through that storytelling that you can really make connections with other folks in the room and make it possible for them as well. And, you know, ultimately the program was designed to not, you know, you don't have to be an entrepreneur to facilitate the program. We have folks from all walks of life, you know, philosophy professors, communication professors, coaches that are out there just coaching youth. You name it, we've got folks who can facilitate the program. And we've just recently in the last year also created the ability for someone to take the program on their own without a facilitator. We have a self-paced delivery of the program that allows for that. The way the course is structured, I've alluded to a little bit. We have the experiential piece, which is our opportunity discovery process. That's sort of our trademarked name on that. And we, through that process, sort of use a basic business canvas that I'll show you, but without the business terminology. The second sort of leg of, you know, the way the course was built was on those entrepreneur video interviews and the videos of them. And it's meant to show socially relatable models for anyone. Anyone can find someone that they can relate to when they're going through the program and seeing these videos. And then around the 8 life lessons, there's content that has been created in the original program. It's video content in sort of a narrated chalkboard format. In the student success and the middle school programs, it's in a textbook format, but with some supplementary videos, some sort of short video clips of the entrepreneurs and other supplemental materials. So the programs were built, but all of them, you know, fall back on those 8 life lessons. And so here's the 3 pieces, sort of a visual. Our Ice House Opportunity Discovery Canvas is a very simple canvas, you know, with 3 basic ideas of really diving in and doing a depth of inquiry into the problem you're trying to solve. What problem are you interested in? And how would you like to solve, you know, not jumping ahead to the solution yet, but really diagnosing that problem and understanding it fully by getting out into the world and interviewing people that have that problem. Then starting to look at your solution. Once you have the problem well defined, okay, how can I get to a great solution that people can buy into? And then ultimately connecting that out into the world. Because if you create something but don't get it out into the world, you're not going to solve their problem, and you're not going to empower yourself as much as you could. So that's sort of how the experiential piece works. The case studies that I mentioned include folks like, this is just a sample of, you know, a couple dozen case studies that are there of the entrepreneur interviews. Folks like Dawn Hafaker in the top left, who is an Iraq war veteran who lost her arm in combat, and, you know, had no entrepreneurial background. She was a military officer, and, you know, recognized that the only way for her to stay connected to her folks that she had left behind on the battlefield, to folks that she had previously been leading, was to come up with a methodology to help them in some way. And she eventually, you know, recognized that with blood loss, you know, that we have capability now in our medical community to stop blood loss very quickly, but those type of technologies weren't getting to the front. So that was her first idea that has since, you know, led to formation of Halfacre and Associates, which, you know, now employs around 175 folks. You know, Jason Campbell, who's the second individual there, you know, on the top, you know, 14 foster, or no, he wasn't quite 14. I think he was about 10 or 11 foster homes. And, through the mentorship of an entrepreneur, was able to turn his GPA around from, very poor, 1.7, 1.9 range, up until like, by the time he was graduating, it was like a 3.4. And he was able eventually to go on, serve honorably in the military, and then San Francisco State University with his bachelor's degree. And folks like, Brian Scudamore on the far right, you might have seen some commercials. He's been on a lot of commercials recently for 1-800-GOT-JUNK. You may not know he started with like $700 in an old beat up truck, and how he's turned that into a $100 million company. Rodney Walker on the bottom left, who we're proud to say has just joined our advisory board. Rodney has an amazing story of, being a foster child in the south side of Chicago, gang activity all around, being homeless at times, and how getting involved with an entrepreneurship education program and a mentor, that combination turned his life around during high school and allowed him to get into Morehouse College, to Yale for his master's program, and now working on his PhD at Harvard. Folks like the folks in the middle on the bottom there are Pikes Peak Community College students that talk about how the program impacted them to, for their community college education. And then Ted and Serena Moore, who in Philadelphia, started a company with, essentially items that had been thrown away by other companies, a fax machine, a printer, et cetera, and how they turned that company into one that employs 80 folks in that area. So it's always somebody there who can connect. And like I said, these are just a small sample. Okay, the other, the third piece of the program is the 8 life lessons. And I'm not really going to dive into them very deeply here. That's what our facilitator training is about. That's what our course is about. But I want to give you a quick overview so you can just get an idea of what it's all based on. So the power of vision, I think we all recognize and hope for the future that my life, if I can make some good choices and if I can move forward, I might be able to overcome whatever type of barriers that I see in my world today. That really forms that foundation of the core concepts. It's that power of choosing the life that you want to have and moving towards that with every breath of your being. So that's what lesson 1 is all about. Lesson 2 is tying into this idea that problems are opportunities. If you're looking outside yourself at other people's problems that you see in the world, not just your own problems, that's maybe a place to start. But how many other people have problems that you have that maybe you want to solve? And recognizing those, that's what lesson 2 is all about. Entrepreneurs, once they have those opportunities recognized, they start acting on them. They don't plan forever. They don't, take 2 years to do a committee and figure out like the best way to solve it. They just start acting. They start playing around with it on the margins. They start experimenting with things on the side. So we talk about that idea. And as they do that, they recognize like, oh, wow, I probably need to learn more about, electronics if I'm trying to build an electronic system or something that can help people. So that's how we've seen this connection with such a strong connection with education, because as folks get into this cycle of recognizing opportunities, of acting on those opportunities, and then learning that there's some things out here I need to learn more about, that's when they really get connected and engaged in their education. That's where we're seeing these impacts on keeping folks in community college or engaging students at the middle school and high school level, because they recognize that if they want to bring their vision out into the world, they're going to have to learn some things. And hey, school is probably a great way to do that. So that pursuit of knowledge is really that fourth critical lesson. Now, as we start building, going in through lessons 5 through 8, we start talking about the things that are thrown off of that cycle of innovation that's happening and growth. And one of those is creating wealth. And in our student success program, that's talked about rather than from a sort of, where people see wealth as just economic, it's talked about it, from the idea of resourcefulness, that you're using whatever is at your disposal, because that's really sort of the core element of what it's all about. Because ultimately, we're not looking for economic wealth necessarily. That's great if that comes out of it, but it's ultimately well-being, where we all would like to be. Lesson 6 about building your brand in that original version is talked about as reliability in the student success version. And then, how entrepreneurs have to build that community of like-minded people. They may have to shed some of the folks that are bringing them down in their daily lives and connect with other people who are entrepreneurial and can help drive their ideas forward. And then as we talked about this idea of resilience and persistence, building up that ability and that optimism over time will happen as you go through this entrepreneurial process. Okay, so we're at our next stopping point, and that's sort of an overview of the Ice House program. Before I dive into some use cases and case studies, I want to make sure and see if there's any other questions going on out there. Nick, is there anything that you're seeing?
Just some more questions about training, specifically if we have anything scheduled in Ohio.
Okay. Which not right now, although we're happy to do one in Ohio. We do on-site trainings, so we can talk to you if you have, you think there's enough folks in your community for a minimum of 15 folks. We do on-site training. So right now, we don't have anything scheduled like publicly in Ohio, but we've done trainings there before, and obviously, 75% of our staff is there in Ohio, so that one's an easy one for us.
Absolutely.
Anything else that's coming to mind for folks right now?
Patrick Snyder's asking about learning more about training for a group in Milwaukee, which, so Rob, do you want to talk a little bit more about perhaps the on-site training process?
Yeah, so the way our trainings work, and actually, let me go ahead and click to the next slide. I'm gonna go to this one and then I'll go back. So the way our trainings worked or work is we train facilitators of our program in a public format where we just pick somewhere around the country. We usually do that, 2 to 3 times a year. We just completed one last week in the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania in Bethlehem. Northampton Community College hosted us. So we did our public training there. I think we had 32 folks. It was a great training there. And that's historically been how we just sort of plan at different places around the country. Then around the world, we're called in to do on-site trainings where with a minimum of 15 people, there's a reduction in the cost, because normally for those public trainings, it's $1,995 for that 3 days of training. With our on-site trainings, that cost is reduced to $1,000 per person, but it's a minimum of 15 people. So if you're interested in hosting a training like that, we can absolutely set that up, and we can, connect with you afterwards, send you, the contract and how everything works, so you can understand that. But ultimately, with an on-site, it's covering, having at least 15 people, and then the $1,000 per person, and then just covering the travel for normally Gary and I to come and perform the training. And I put this slide up there just to show the scope. Over since 2011, we've trained, coming up on 2,400 folks. And so you'd be joining, to go through our training, you're joining, a pretty large group of individuals out there. And those facilitators are reaching about 10,000 folks annually. Obviously, not everybody is using our programs, but each year, we have a large number of folks that are getting it out into the world. All right. So let me run through this portion and give you an idea about how the program has been used, and then we'll just open it up for last questions before we're done for the day. So we like to talk about the impact we're having, because ultimately that's what this work is all about for us. It doesn't do much good to get an idea out into the world, at least from our perspective, unless it's truly impacting people and helping them. And so I just put a sample out there, a small sample of the types of institutions and organizations that we're working with currently. Either, we've done an on-site training, or we have folks who are using the course materials and the curriculum to get it out into the world. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Tecnológico de Monterrey and our work with them down in Mexico. You see groups all across the board here: community colleges, Kentucky Highlands Investment Corporation, which is trying to grow entrepreneurship throughout Kentucky. The California community college system, we've done a lot throughout California, lots of trainings, and a lot of our work is happening there. So you see lots of community colleges, some university. The city of Albuquerque, I'm going to dig into a little bit. And then we have folks like in Bermuda. We had a few folks at our training just last week from Bermuda doing economic development. And so throughout, or Erie's public schools, I'm also going to talk about, but we also have and are, glad to be supported by some institutions like the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation, which is trying to, grow entrepreneurship across Africa. And they're a large foundation. They've brought Gary in a number of times, and he's done some trainings there. And then NC IDEA, which now has a great initiative to impact 100,000 people across North Carolina with the entrepreneurial mindset. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But just to give you a sample and an idea of the types of folks we're working with. All right. Not all inclusive, but a pretty good list of folks who are using the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program on any given day. Middle school, I'm going to talk about Erie a little bit. High school programs, many times that's being done in a sort of typical business program or a class on entrepreneurship, but not always. Community colleges, I'm going to talk to you specifically about a student success initiative with Pikes Peak Community College, but probably our vast majority in the community college space are doing it in an Entrepreneurship 101 class, sort of that intro to entrepreneurship if they already have an entrepreneurship curriculum. And then we work with their entrepreneurship faculty to do workshops or trainings at their community college, sort of like we're doing with Northampton right now, to try and get the word out to the rest of the college and the community that entrepreneurship is much more than a business discipline, and therefore draw students in from across the college. So essentially, we're trying to help grow those entrepreneurship programs at those community colleges. Same thing with the four-year universities. We're doing some work with Lindenwood University right now. We're going to have our, I don't think we've announced it yet, but we're planning on a training there in St. Louis area this coming June. And then, like I mentioned, economic developers all throughout, chambers of commerce, economic development organizations, et cetera. We do things specifically with veterans, specifically for small business, like small business development centers, reentry programs, folks coming out of prison or nearly, re-entering society, workforce development programs. We're Career Source down in Florida. We've been excited to work with them, and we just did some training down there. They're starting to get some ideas of how those can get out and to help people get back more effectively into the workforce. Learning and development, I'm going to talk a little bit about Albuquerque and how they're using the program to impact their line employees. And then nonprofit organizations. We do a lot of work with nonprofit organizations, the folks like RCAP and CERCAP, specifically here in Virginia and in the southeast of the country, who are impacting folks in poverty, many times in rural situations, and trying to give them this entrepreneurial mindset to help them move forward. We're not a fly-by-night organization. We've been profiled on NPR, these places, CNN Money, USA Today, article on our prior president, on Brie Langemo in the Huffington Post about her entrepreneurial journey. And so we're not fly-by-night, been out there doing this for quite a while. And to talk through some of the impact that we love showing this quote from Madison, who was one of the 7th grade students up in Erie, Pennsylvania, who went through our program through her 7th grade social studies class. It was actually a great opportunity that the United Way there funded us to train 25 folks from the Erie Public Schools, all their 7th grade teachers, as well as administrators, counselors, to sort of embed this entrepreneurial mindset in their middle schools. And as the kids are going through the program, there's a great video out there. You can look it up if on YouTube. It's on our YouTube. But Madison is one of the folks that's quoted in there, and we just really like it because it shows the power of this way of thinking. If they can change those problems and opportunities, they can make Erie a better place, and that's what we want the youth of today to be looking at. In the high school level, we've over the last few years had an agreement with Prepatec, which is the preparatory school for Tecnológico de Monterrey throughout Mexico. And at 37 different campuses, 7,500 students have been through the Ice House Student Success Program over that each year. And they were specifically looking at a number of outcomes that they were trying to achieve. And one of them was development of these 21st century skills that, I sort of alluded to at the beginning of the presentation about the communication, problem solving, collaboration, et cetera. And they, besides the impact that they saw on the students, it was like 94% of the faculty who honestly didn't want to go to the training in the first place because they were like, why are we having to, do this? 94% of the faculty, after they implemented the program, said, yes, we need to continue this. So for us, that was a big win to show the power of this type of thinking and what it can do in a high school setting. In a community college setting, this is what I was alluding to a minute ago about the Student Success Program and what was done at Pikes Peak. Now, this is now a few years ago. This was 2014, 2015, I believe. But when this first pilot course was done, Dr. Bolton, that I have here on the screen, the president at Pikes Peak, made the decision that, we've got a student success program that does the typical student success things at most community colleges, taking notes, making sure you're using your resources, using your counselors effectively, how to work with the faculty, all those good things that, are built into those programs. Our program, however, took those basic concepts, but then expanded them as well with all of this work around the entrepreneurial mindset. And he said, okay, let's run a blind study with our developmental ed students, our students who are coming in to Pikes Peak, but haven't successfully passed the math or English AccuPlacer test to allow them to take college classes. So during their first semester, there's about 1,600 of these students. Around 800 were put into each of the 2 student success courses. And we were happy to see that the students who went through the Ice House program persisted to the next semester. So they came back in that spring semester at an 83% rate, which was 28% higher than the 55% who persisted that took that other student success course. So from our perspective, that was an outstanding demonstration of the power of the entrepreneurial mindset to connect with the reason why you're going to school and to persist through your college education. And Dr. Bolton at the time said, if it would have been 2.8%, I would have been happy. He was blown away and had the data folks, they had to go back and make sure that 28% higher rate was correct. So just a great example there of the power of it at the college and university level. Another initiative I want to point out, and this is because it's a statewide initiative that's going on, is in the state of West Virginia. And I was actually just on another webinar with some librarians in the eastern part of West Virginia that I will allude to here in a minute. But around West Virginia, we had an opportunity to train 60 folks from all 9 of their community colleges. And so we're trying to embed, the goal of the community college system of West Virginia is to embed these entrepreneurial mindset ideas into the culture of their community colleges. So to get their administration, their faculty, all thinking in this entrepreneurial way, so that ultimately it rolls down to the students and they can make the students and the state more entrepreneurial. So we have some pilot programs going on at Mount West and Eastern West Virginia that they're just starting to teach the students, but I think we're seeing some great impact and hope to have some results from that over the next few years. The learning and development portion of the program, or sort of example that we use is Albuquerque, New Mexico. One of our facilitators here that I have on the screen, Tom Darling, he started off at, he started off with the program at Central New Mexico at their community college there. And eventually through, doing a sort of pilot program with the city, the mayor found out about it and said, wow, Tom, what you're teaching these folks is exactly what our city employees need to hear. So we brought Tom over and put Tom in charge of what they call their public service university, essentially their HR training program. And Tom has been working since then to get all 6,000 of their city employees through the program. He's up to about 700 now and seeing some outstanding results. And I should mention that for each one of these, when you'll get a follow-up email from us, Nick's going to have connections and links in that email to all of these examples and how you can, see more details behind each of these case studies, as well as others that we have out there. I want to point out, this is an image of one of our facilitator training groups that we did down in Raleigh a few months ago. Actually, this one was about a year ago now, 9 months or so ago. And this is through that initiative with NCIDEA, the foundation there in Raleigh, who is trying to build an entrepreneurial ecosystem throughout North Carolina. And with their goal of impacting 100,000 people across the state with the entrepreneurial mindset, this was our first cohort of folks we've trained. We're up to around 150 now and plan to train another few hundred over the next few years, because to hit 100,000 people, it's going to require that number. And we've seen some really exciting things coming out of this. There's programs going on all throughout the state. One of the ones I want to point out is Duncan Smith from EBSCO, who is a provider of services for public libraries and K through 12 college libraries throughout the world, one of the biggest providers of that, recognized his story where he was a librarian who had created a company called Novelist, which has become a big thing in the library community, and how that grew over 15 or 20 years, and how our process and everything that we talk about in the Ice House program was essentially his journey, and starting off as just a librarian and moving and seeing and growing this idea that he had to build Novelist. So from that idea, there's a pilot program going on in North Carolina right now where another training we did, we had 22 librarians go through the training. They're now implementing and doing different things with the program around the state. And that's also led to the state of Georgia, where you can access the program through their state library system. If you have a library card, you can access the program for free. So if anybody's calling in from Georgia, you've got a library card, you can go and see the program that way. So just like to point that out, that's sort of a growth area. It's something we're seeing where we can impact lots of people, because our libraries around the world are a community gathering center where everyone can go and learn, and we ultimately want to get this idea around the mindset out to them. I point out previously that self-paced version of the program. This is another way we're trying to get the word out to more people around the world. We have a lot of international folks that are interested in our work. And many times it's very expensive for them to travel and come, and they may not have the resources to come to one of our trainings, since most of the time they're here in the US. So we now have a self-paced program that you'll also have that link to. It sells for $199, but it's essentially, it's going to take you a while to get through it. We know the value is there. And I think you'll enjoy the opportunity to go through it on a self-paced. We have the exercises embedded where you can go through the opportunity discovery process. You get to do a journaling process where you're really thinking deeply about your vision for the future, about what, goal setting for yourself, and then overcoming maybe previous mindsets that you've formed. So you'll have more information from that in our follow-up as well, and we can get you more information about our self-paced programs. And then lastly, we've had some questions about our upcoming training. For the first time, if you missed what I mentioned previously, for our first time here in February 6th, we're going to do over 4 weeks. We're going to be doing a blended training where Gary and I will meet with the class each week for about 90 minutes. And then you're going to have a lot of work to do. It's a pretty in-depth course to go through this online training. But you're going to consume the entire Ice House program. And then you're also going to interact and do some interactive activities throughout the training, both in class during that 90 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of homework and readings for you to do in between. And we're excited to say we were able to get the cost down of that training to $995 for anyone, whereas our normal training is $2,000. So we feel like this may be, open up more opportunity for folks to get into this training. And we recognize you might not be able to hit all 4 nights. So we're going to record each of those sessions to where you can watch them on your own afterwards. So even if the dates don't work perfectly for you, you'll still be able to complete the training in the month of February. And this is a pilot for us. It's the first time we're doing it. So if it goes well and good feedback, we'll plan to continue that. But we're still going to be doing our on-site trainings and our public trainings as well. All right. Well, we're right at 12 o'clock Eastern here in Virginia. I want to see if there's any other questions that I can answer before we sign off.
Just some specific ones so far that I was able to answer, or I'll be following up with people via email.
Great.
And to that point, if anyone has any questions after the fact, you can always reply to the follow-up email. I'll be the one sending that out, and I'm more than happy to respond via email or set up a time to chat on the phone.
Sounds good. Well, with that, I really want to thank y'all for attending the webinar today, and hopefully it was informative, and hope to hear from you in the future. Thanks a lot. Have a great rest of your week.